Hello and welcome to part 4 of the etch brass soldering demo. I hope you've enjoyed numbers 1, 2 and 3, which are still available on my channel. And I've set up a playlist with all of those in one place, so it should be quite easy to find. This time we're going to start talking about the drop lights, about the sides and the ends putting together, and getting on towards making something that looks like a coach. A couple of things I just wanted to mention whilst we go along. It's really important, particularly if you're modelling a prototype. If you're making up a freelance model that's in your head, then you might want to make a little drawing or something like that yourself, or maybe just decide as you go along. That's fine. But if you're modelling against a prototype, then do search out photographs of every angle you can. Try and visit the actual railway if that's possible, and have a good look around it, under it, over it. Try and take a photo from an overbridge if you can to see what the colour the roof is and any details on the roof. Look underneath. One of the things you'll often see under carriages are things called truss rods or battery boxes or brake tanks and those kind of things. And although some of it you can't see and it's kind of therefore pointless modelling it, a lot of it does change the shadows or change the look of the model underneath. So it really is worth adding it, otherwise your model will look a bit toy-like, if you like. So yeah, it's important to look at those. And I'll give you some tips about how we can do that kind of thing. But definitely get yourself some good photos. You can obviously set up an iPad or something, or a phone with the photos in it, and categorise them by different type of carriage, or indeed you could print. So just wanted to mention a couple of extra tools whilst we're at it. The first is often once you're using your file, and we've used this quite a bit through the first couple of episodes of this, you'll find that you get bits of solder, bits of whatever you're filing into the teeth. This one isn't too bad, but you can see already there's some bits and pieces gone into there, and of course that will affect its ability and its effectiveness as a file. So I've got this thing here. This is a Draper. It was £2.99 from Squires, I believe, and it's got these clever metallic teeth shaped in a particular way so that it can really get into the teeth and clear them out. And you just literally run it along like that, and it will clear out the file. So that's a useful thing. Don't think when your file's getting a bit clogged up that's the end for it and you can chuck it. It's probably got many years worth of life left if you just get yourself one of those. You could use a knife blade to literally push along each of the rows of the teeth in the file, and that would clear it out as well. Take you a long time, but it would work. This just speeds up that process. And the second thing I wanted to mention is I didn't mention a Dremel at the start of this series. That is a very useful thing for grinding, for diamond cutting. If later you get onto loco kits and that kind of thing, you might want to use that to cut an axle or a motor shaft, that kind of thing, using a diamond edged cutting blade. And there are various polishing and various multi-tool pieces you can use in a Dremel, and it's usually mains powered with a kind of wheel where you can turn it up, turn it down. And I've got one of those, but I only usually get it out when I'm really doing a big piece of cutting, that kind of thing. But that principle of using a kind of multi-bit to get in and file and grind and clear stuff is still useful. You can get these things. So this is a nails decorator. It's actually made for fingernails and that kind of stuff. And I got it on eBay for a few quid. It's got a couple of AA batteries in the bottom, and a simple button, one speed. It is what it is, and it'll never be as fast as a Dremel, you can see there. But you can easily change the tops into different shapes, and because it's handheld and simple and doesn't have a wire and all that, you can get in quickly and use it to polish. And you can hear, it's pretty effective. You can use it to get rid of manky solder or just some kind of mark you might have put onto the brass, etc., whilst you're going along. And it's pretty effective, and it was a couple of quid. So it's certainly not required, but it's another tool in the arsenal to use. So let's just look at some of those items that you might see on the bottom of a carriage kit. So this is a Festiniog curly roof van, and on the bottom of this we've got these, we use a cocktail stick to show you, so I think that worked quite well in the previous video. You can see here this diagonal line down, a straight line, and then another diagonal up, and two posts in the middle, and that's what's called a truss rod. And there are various methods of making those up. They're basically just bent wire. This, for example, here is the chassis of a Welsh Highland Railway summer coach, and on here I've actually used some pieces of evergreen styrene to create a little H piece like that, and then I have soldered, not very elegantly because you won't see it, but a piece of wire. I've then used a dab of super glue on the top there, and then another soldered joint there. This piece in the middle was a piece of insulation from a piece of wire which I'd cut off, and I just cut to shape and literally put the wire through it. In reality, on the real thing, it's a kind of tightening bolt or screw thing, but that's enough just to give the indentation, the kind of, particularly in 009 where it's 4mm scale, enough of a belief that there's something there. Another way of doing that, and this here is a Festiniog super barns, or super saloon as we're supposed to call them, interior, which I've just actually been painting as it goes. That's a thankless task, but anyway, should have painted them before I installed the seats, but anyway, there's another tip for you. On this one, I've actually created a piece of U-shaped brass that goes up, across and up, and soldered it on. Again, not very elegantly because you won't see it, so I didn't bother to clean it up, but obviously it's then been painted over with primer and then black, and I've used that to create the truss rods either side, so I've not needed the H piece in between. But we can also see a couple of, I think these are battery boxes, that kind of thing. Now these happen to be 3D prints, or you could create it from evergreen strip, that kind of thing. This is the 3D printed version, and you literally just stick it on with a bit of super glue. And the whole idea really is just that underneath here you can see the battery box there, you can see the truss rods, and you get a bit of an impact. If you didn't have that under the carriage, then this would be completely fresh air and it wouldn't look great. So that detailing is useful. Now the reason I'm saying this now is because our Vale of Rydal coach that we are building doesn't need any of that, partly because it has this this extra piece of underframe which broadly kind of hides everything that was under there anyway, but also because there's very, very little under there. You will also find that there are things like brake tanks and that kind of thing. And one other approach which is quite interesting, here I'll show you. This is a Welsh Pawn and Llanfair coach, and the underframe built in the usual way that we've talked about, with the strengthening piece along the side. But on this occasion I've actually bought a 3D printed chassis. This one was from Shapeways, and I have dunked that in white spirit to get rid of the kind of waxy feeling you get after that. And this includes things like the brake tanks. It also has its own bogie pivots, which have all been beautifully designed in CAD to actually take their own 3D printed bogies, which literally sit on top of those pivots beautifully. There is a tab on the end to take a coupling, and we'll of course have to think about how that's going to work with the ends of the carriage when we get to that point, and also the truss rods. Now, only unfortunate thing on this occasion is that these truss rods are so tiny that they've actually started to warp slightly, so I'm going to have to probably put a little bit of wire behind them just to keep them straight. But you can see the principle, and of course you can see those that tightening nut thing that I was mentioning a minute ago. But it allows you to get all kinds of details like this this brake tank here and the actuators and all the rest of it. And of course it's all one 3D piece, which will just sit on the bottom there and be glued on, and that really makes making that underframe a lot easier. Okay, so let's talk about how we get the sides and the ends of the coach together into a box. So this here is a Worsley Works Welsh Brawn and Llanfair Pickering coach, and I've actually created that already into a box, and you can see the fillets down the edges there to keep it at 90 degrees, and you know it is pretty much bang on. You'll probably get some camera oddities by the shape I show you, but it is exactly at 90 degrees. Now, how did I manage to do that? It was using the clever clip, and we'll come on to that first. But as I've said before in these programs, it's also important to plan ahead. And one of the things we do have on these Vale of Rydal coaches are that there are these drop lights that sit behind the doors, and they're like a recessed panel for the window, which can then drop down using the leather strap thing. It will be far easier to do them now, whilst this is just a flat shape, than when we're actually in this situation. Now, you could still do it, but it's just a bit more fiddly. So better to plan ahead, get the drop lights in first now, and then make it into the box. So we're going to start with the drop lights. So the first thing is that this coach kit had actually been in a box for a little bit of time, and we've actually got a little bit of discoloration of the brass and that kind of thing going on. That won't make it that easy to solder. So what you need to do, and you can see I've done it here already, is get your fiberglass brush on there and just gently, without bending the brass, carefully just polish it up. That will make it a lot easier to get the solder to flow. It's also just a bit prettier, and in time it will also help the paint adhere, particularly the primer, the initial primer coat, to adhere to the brass. So well worth doing, but as ever, be careful of those little bristles that come off the fiberglass. Okay, so drop lights. So on this occasion in this kit we have these tiny little drop lights which have some extra tabs on the end. Now this is very clever, and I've not come across this before. But basically what you have to do is take some, you probably use your fingers actually because it's quite thin brass this, but you have these little tabs on the end. I'm going to use the long nose pliers and just gently bend those with the half etched crease to the inside of the fold, as is normal on almost every kit, and just move them through to 90 degrees. Now this is so small it's going to be really hard to show you, but I'm going to try. So there you go, we're about at 90 degrees, not quite on that one there, and then they go into, a bit like the tab and slot we saw on the chassis, into tiny little slots in the brass door. Now of course the important thing is get the right side and not to accidentally solder it onto the other side, because then you'll have put solder, even if you remove it, on the front of the actual coach. So be very careful with that. On this occasion this coach is not that obvious which is the front and the back, but what you have got is a half etched line that shows you the door, the kind of gap around the door when the door's shut, and that obviously is the front and this is the rear, and it's the rear we're going to place these through, and then we're going to solder them on. So I've now got another one here in place. The two little tabs go through to the other side, to the side where the door half etched line is, and they become like little hinges, if you like. Just see there, little hinges, and they also align the drop light really nicely into the center of the aperture of the door, which means you'll always get, with this particular design, and it's the first time I've seen this, so most kits don't have this unfortunately, but maybe they will now in the future. You have this quite impressive hinge detail, but also you make sure the drop light's bang on in the middle. What you'd normally have to do is get yourself a clip or something like that. Wood is better because it doesn't conduct the heat or effectively lose some of the heat from the iron. But I also use these metal clips, and people say that they're like a heat sink. They are a bit, but when you're talking about quite small bits of soldering onto tiny areas of brass, it is really irrelevant. So I would have clipped it on like that, got it absolutely correct, happy with it, and then very gingerly and carefully put it down, and then got the solder on quickly. With this, because of those little hinges, we've actually got that alignment already, which is really nice. So we'll then get in with the phosphoric acid and give it a bit of solder around there. I'm still going to use the clip actually, and I've just thought about this as I've been talking, because if we don't clip it completely flat to the brass, there is more of a chance that the solder will seep underneath and start to show through on the other side, which will mean that the recess of the door drop light will get a bit of solder in it, and that will, it's not a huge thing, but you probably then have to get in with a knife and clean it up, and it'll affect it when it's painted because it won't look perfectly flat. It will have little bumps and stuff, which is probably not acceptable. So I'm going to clamp it down just to try and avoid that solder going through. Okay, so here we are back with the solder iron on. I've given it a clean as per the previous videos. I've also upgraded my Manky brush to this old Humbrol detail brush, which I decided had got beyond its painting capabilities. It's certainly seen quite a bit of painting, and it is now a liquid flux brush, which will ultimately mean it will be on its way out because the flux will attack it. So here we have the little drop light, hinges into the slots, a little clip just to keep it in the right place. It's perfectly aligned thanks to the hinges, which is really nice little design. That I really do like that. First time I've seen it. And then we're just going to put a tiny amount of flux, and on this occasion the fact I've got a detailed brush which allows me to get into those seams. There's a reason why we started earlier on in these videos with large areas of solder that didn't really need a lot of accuracy. We're now into an area where we're going to try and put smaller amounts of solder on to reduce the cleanup, and also to try and avoid filling some of the pre-drilled holes, which are for door handles and handrails in time, with solder. So if you try and keep the flux away from those holes, that will definitely help. And you also want to just take a small amount of solder on the iron and keep coming back for more solder bit by bit, rather than having a great big beast of a piece which you then blump on, and it'll go over and fill up all these holes and create little mountains of solder, which we don't want. So popped on a bit of flux there, pop on the absorber. I did forget that last video, sorry about that. And then we're going to use a tiny amount of solder, and then probably just using something to hold down the brass to stop it moving. Make sure you're happy. On this occasion we've got the hinges coming through the other side, so if I put it onto the glass it's going to end up bowing out slightly, so I'm going to do it kind of over the edge. I'm thinking of this as I'm doing it. Back, we didn't get any, little bit of solder on there, and then I'm going to hold the brass in place, make sure we're happy that it's all square. Does appear to be very good, and then we'll just gently put a tiny amount of solder on, and that's it. And then of course we can take the clip off, go through to the other side, and just check that we're happy, which we are. So that is all good. So here we go. We're now looking at the front side of the coach, and in is this drop light. A very tiny amount of solder has come through, but we can clean that up with a knife, or probably not enough to be too much of a bother. And on the rear we've got a nice soldered seam around. I actually did 3 sides, didn't see the point in adding this side. It didn't need it for strength, and it was already broad, very flat. I managed to avoid getting solder into the holes that take the door handles and grab handles and I think there might even be a window bar that goes across this window later as well. There's a little hole for that, which we've avoided as well. Now I think it's useful if we show what you would do if this went wrong as well. And part of the reason for that is in fact that this one, which I tried to put on a second ago, slightly moved down, and when I compared it with the second one, which was completely beautifully in the middle, discovered of course they didn't match quite, and we're probably talking 0.5 millimeter, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so that's probably just me. Most people would probably leave it, but so I thought, well, I'll take it off, and of course just useful to explain how you do that if something goes wrong. So the answer is more flux, heat from the iron, and then you just need something to get underneath. And I actually used the, sorry I didn't film this, the edge of a very sharp scalpel just to, with my left hand, whilst I was desoldering, heating the solder up so it became liquidy again, and then just literally pulled it up whilst it was still heated so the solder was molten, and then pulled it away. And then all you need to do is go in with a file and gently file it back so that there are no sharp edges, etc. So let's for a second imagine, I'll cut off the tabs just to show the point. So no tabs anymore. What would we do if we didn't have those little alignment tabs? And of course those alignment tabs are not completely perfect because the slot and the tab are not absolutely the same size. So we're going to put this on using just the clip, and it's a little bit more complicated because we haven't got the alignment, but it's still quite easy. Now the first thing to say about the drop light, and I'll hold it up to the camera, is that actually one end is slightly wider than the other, so the top and the bottom are slightly wider. Now that is just the design of the kit. If you look at the prototype photos, as is the case with the one I've just done, you broadly see the same width all the way around. So we just need to position this and clamp it in place such that we've got broadly the same all the way around. There's also a front and a back. It doesn't make a lot of difference, but sometimes you might see that the edge of the brass has got a slight kind of bend to it one side. It's almost like a rebate, and the other side's a bit harsher. So it's designed to be that way forward. If you did it that way, no one will ever notice, but you might know, so you might not want to do that. It's designed to go that way around. So we will pop this on. And of course, because I've unsoldered this, it's already got a little bit of solder around it, so we're not going to need a huge amount of extra solder on there. Pop it in place, use these clips, and I've got a couple of different types of clips. They actually come, I should show you this, as long clips, like this length, which are good for getting right into sections where you want to clip things. But the further you get away from the pivot point, the less kind of clump they have. So I actually chop them back so that these ones are a bit shorter. I also have one where I've chopped back, either because it broke or because I chopped it. I think I chopped it. It may have broken at some point, into a single clamp to really get into a corner, that kind of thing as well. So have different types of clamps for different situations, and you'll usually find you've got what you need. These clamps as well have a kind of flat side, that side, and a clampy side, that side. So you want to put it in the clamp down so that you can put it nice and broadly flat on the glass. We can then look through the other side and then gently with our finger try and get it so that we're as happy as can potentially be, and it is easy for these to move later, so I am very, very careful. See, that's not quite right. It's maybe 1/4 millimeter too high. So we will just move that about a little bit. And that's pretty good. Then you have to be super careful. Now you don't want to knock it, and you've got to be very careful indeed. And going back to what we said in a previous episode, I'm just going to put flux on the top side, and I'm going to just tack a tiny amount of solder on without moving the brass. And that's probably what happened when I was trying to do it on camera earlier. It moved even though it had the tabs and slots. So I'm just going to gently tap a piece on. It doesn't need to look pretty, just needs to keep it held, and you'll know if it's held because it'll fall off if it isn't. And then we can see that that is, if we bring it to the camera, very good, and a lot better than it was a minute ago. And so it was the right thing to take it off and redo it. And then we can pop a little bit of flux around the other sides. Now, because this one's been on and off, I'm still going to clamp it down because I don't want the solder to seep through to the other side. So even though it's secure where it is, we will there's a little bit of solder here, and there you go, on one side, and we'll do a piece along there as well. And we're all in. Happy days. It's fast becoming a catchphrase, I believe, on these videos. Trying to avoid you saying that too much. Something like that. There we go. Final job here is just to get in the back and make sure that the rear faces of the drop light are nice and square. Why do you need to do that? Because in time you want to put glazing material over that, and you want it to be nice and flat so that the glazing sits nice and flat. And then if you like your tidiness, you can also go in and just improve the areas you've put the solder on just by tidying them up a little bit, which will probably take off any flux that was on there as well, which is a good thing as well. Just get into all the different angles, being very careful not to bend the brass side. Of course you can bend it back if you do, but you'll find you never quite get it back to perfectly square, and that's a bit annoying later when you want to put the roof on. It's always easier if it kind of looks broadly square. So we'll just get in and do a bit of cleaning up. Don't be too crazy about it, but worth just doing that. Use the makeup brush just to get rid of the other blank. And there we have 1, 2, 3 drop lights. Usually these will be in every door, sometimes also windows, so pay attention because the size can be different between the aperture for the window and the door, so make sure you get the right one in the right place, and they're rarely if ever labelled. And we have a side done. I will now do the other side. We already did the riveting on the ends last week, so we're then ready to make this into a box. So I'll see you in a minute when I've done these other 3. Best way to get rid of the solder is probably using that chisel type device that I showed you in the tools video, or perhaps just the corner of the needle file. It's not sharp, but it's got enough of a push to get through the solder without damaging the brass, and just gently get in there, and so you can see that, and then you'll see the little bits of solder come out. There's the solder gone, and it's broadly gone there. It was only a little bit that came through, but it's quite useful to show you that. Now on this occasion I've had a look at these hinges, and my feeling is they protrude an awful long way beyond the door. I mean, probably a good 1.25 mil. We're in 4 mil scale. 4 mils a foot, 2 mils 6 inches, 1 mil is obviously 3 inches. So we're looking at those being something like 4 inches protruding. 4 inches for a hinge, too much. In my opinion, I haven't actually measured the hinges at the Vale of Rydal, but I reckon they're probably half that. So I've decided to use the hinge pieces, top tab and slot things, just for the purposes of alignment, and then using these Xeron cutters, I've found that if you then just twist, then the tiny little tab will come off. And then what I'll probably do is super glue a tiny little hinge on top, and you can buy those hinges on little frets from various manufacturers, MJT possibly, those kind of places. You get them at shows, and I think that will be far more prototypical. The slot coming through is just too big. Now we could try and chop those slots, but I tried that and they just bent off, so I thought, well, I'll just bend them all off then. And so they're useful for alignment, but otherwise I don't actually think they're going to look right. They're going to look too coarse. Okay, so we now have the sides with their drop lights in. We have the ends where we did the riveting, and we are ready to start making this into a box. Now you'll notice that the sides on this coach are the same, both sides. The ends are both the same as well, so there is limited opportunity for us to mess this up. But on other coach kits, etc., you'll find that the sides are mirrored, or in some cases completely different. They have wide doors one end, single doors one end. You could have an observation end. You could have plenty of differences. For example, the Taliesin Railway, the doors only open one side, they're locked on the other side. There are things to think of like that as well. But on this occasion, we're okay, because whether we do it like that or we do it like that, we're always going to get this right. Which is part of the reason I chose this kit as one which you might want to use. The other, I suppose, and it's probably worth mentioning this at this point, is that these are Vale of Rydal modern coaches. The plastic kit is widely available by Dundas for the original coaches, or certainly historic coaches. And we are expecting, hopefully, everyone's expecting Model Rail to come out with a Vale of Rydal 262 tank relatively soon, hopefully. That was launched a couple of years ago. You can see it mentioned in the pages of the Model Rail magazine, so it is sponsored by or a Model Rail product effectively, and we're expecting to see them soon. So hence the idea was to build a couple of these coaches to have as a prototypical train. And of course it's a lovely railway up at Aberystwyth on the coast in mid Wales, and if you're in the area you should definitely visit. So this is the micro mark we found now, is the manufacturer, although we can only find them, friends online can only find them overseas. I suspect this was rebadged and resold by someone, but I cannot remember where from. In fact, I think I inherited it from my dad in reality, but it's very, very good tool. So if you see them around, do get them. And I think there are other versions of this, albeit in plastic, which obviously if you melt the plastic, it's not going to end well. So metal ones are better. Technically, I suppose you could make your own as well if you really wanted to. They're not that complicated. It's a right angular piece of aluminium, and then these little pads with two bits of brass that can clamp the brass at 90 degrees, and that is all it is. So basically, get them in. You've got a thumb wheel so you can get it all nice and straight. What you're trying to do here is get the top of the side of the carriage, often called the cant rail, exactly in line with the bottom radius of the curvature of the roof on the end. Sometimes it's easier to align the bottom if the chassis is at the same level, but on this occasion the ends continue down beyond the body side, because we've obviously got that kind of girder piece on the bottom of the chassis. And then you also need to think about whether the side will go over the end or inside the end. And I've found from making lots of these kits that in almost all circumstances it's easier or better, or the way it's designed, for the end to abut to the side, which is hence why you've got to get rid of all those tabs, and for the side to actually overlap slightly. It gives you a little bit more room in the width of the carriage, and given that we have these strengthening pieces along the side, if you go for inside the end, you'll often find that the carriage then bows out because there's just not enough room, in my opinion, for all of that brass to sit inside it. So I go like that. Technically, I suppose you end up with a line on the back there, but if it's well soldered joint and the two pieces of brass are nicely square and have been filed with the tabs off, and you don't have something like a drop light at the end, which can complicate it, then you're fine, and you could even drop a thin seam of filler or something in it afterwards if you were really bothered. But most people will not see it. I've got a Worsley Works Festiniog Brown Marshall luggage van here that's in the paint shop, not finished yet, but nearly. You can't really see the fact that the ends are overlapping. I'd be amazed if you could, but it makes the whole kit a lot easier to put together. So there we go. We've now clamped the side and the end together into this 90-degree clamp machine, call it that. I've made sure that the top of the side is absolutely flush with this bottom of the radius. I've made sure that the thing is square there, etc. And the really clever bit then is that on the reverse we have a hole where we can keep the whole thing clamped, and we can then dump a nice seam of solder in there. As a dump, yeah, obviously it's a craft skill, but pop your flux through there, and then we can make sure that these sides are absolutely at 90 degrees. So pop in the flux there, on with that, and just the key thing is just not to move it, is to leave those clamps nicely in place and get the solder in place. Again, you can put a piece on to tack solder, and then we can start to just move that solder around using the flux. Don't be frightened of it. Nice hot iron, nice clean two pieces of brass, and smoker's all on, all good. Wait a few seconds. Obviously if you do this too quickly it won't quite have solidified, and then you can undo the two sides of the clamp, and hopefully there we go, one lovely 90-degree bend. And then when you remove it from the clamp, we've got a lovely 90-degree bend, but of course we've only managed to do the soldering in that gap in the clamp. So I'm going to go back in and add just 2 bits of fillet there, just to give it that strength at the corner. But it is beautifully square. Happy days there. And we'll do the same for the other end on the side there, and then we can put the two together. I'll show that in a minute on another video. Put the lid on the flux, and we will want to get in with the file just to make sure that's nice and flat in both that dimension and that dimension, because the little brackets, which I still don't have a name for them, but we're going to call them reinforcing brackets, go on there, and obviously ultimately the chassis is going to fit there with the bracket in there, and if this is too much kind of bumpy solder in there, it won't sit flat. So we'll just go in there and gently, you can do it on there as well, like that. Just get any excess solder, there wasn't a lot in reality there, just off, so that you're going to end up with a nice seam the way along. And you can use the bigger file if you need, and that kind of thing. Just check it in all dimensions is happy. If you end up, I haven't on this occasion, but if you ended up with the end slightly inset, then you might want to go back with the solder and just push it gently out, more flux, and just gently push it out, perhaps with a clamp or something, just to hold it as you push it, and then wait a few seconds for it to solidify. That's all possible. Remember, solder isn't a one-off thing. You can go back in, you can melt it again, and you can get it going. On this occasion it's absolutely fine, so no need to do that. So there we go, 2 sides now with their 90-degree ends on. And the next job will be, of course, to bring it together into a box. But we're really starting to see a coach coming together, and it's at this point that I think you can start to get excited about the progress you're making, because it starts to look like a coach, doesn't it? If you don't have one of these clamps, then you're going to have to start using something like a heavy set square to put it up against. And that of course gets harder the minute you've got pieces that have already got their ends on, and you've got to try your best to keep it at 90 degrees, probably use a little bit of cork under there, and get in quickly, tack it, check it, but getting it to 90 degrees is just difficult, and probably takes 3 or 4 attempts before you're happy. This just holds them nicely at 90. There are other ways. You could use a piece of wood that's you know is square, and of course wood's easy because it won't conduct the heat. You could use a different type of clamp. There are some available, but they do tend to be plastic, and it's just trying to avoid them melting. Perhaps one option would be to clamp another piece of metal between the plastic clamp and the brass to act as a heat sink, maybe a piece of cork actually rather than metal, something like that. There are lots of other options, but if you can get a clamp like this or something similar, it's definitely the best way. Okay, so then we're going to clamp the 2 sides together. This is a little bit more difficult, but all you need to do is just keep fiddling with it, keep clamping until you're absolutely fine. Use your finger just to check it's at 90 degrees. But you must copy whatever you did. So if you put the long side outside the end, as I did, then you must do the same on the other side, otherwise you'll end up with a wonky coach, which isn't going to look great and probably won't run well, because it will be even by the width of the brass, but it will be slightly wider one side than the other, so it will probably wobble over its pivots. So pop that in there, and then you can almost check the other end that you feel it's going to make it, which it is, and then same point. It's just a little bit more fiddly because now you've got to get through there. Clean the iron, a little bit of solder, kind of medium-sized piece. Now this is interesting because you see that there, the solder has actually fallen off the iron. So at this point, I tend to dial my iron down to the 300 degrees, not the 400, because it's getting hard to kind of manipulate the solder and keep it on the tip, perhaps because it's got too hot. And so I just dial it down and just find it a bit easier to keep the solder on, otherwise it ends up dropping into there like that and becoming too liquid. So dial it down to the 300, and you can keep fiddling between 300 or 400 if you've got a temperature controlled iron like mine, or if you've got a single temperature, so it's hard to talk with that one, single temperature iron, then you'll probably find it's fine at whatever temperature it's at. Now this end's interesting because we do now have a drop light that is just in there, that's getting slightly in the way of the clamp being at 90 degrees. So to make that work, I'm not clamping it as hard as I would ordinarily. So that means there's more chance of it moving around, so we've got to be more careful. But it keeps it at 90 degrees and you don't end up with a kind of kink before the bend. So it's one to just keep an eye on where you've got a drop light, because you've effectively got double the thickness there. But it will be fine as long as you don't over tighten the clamp, because then the clamp will just bow out the brass. Here we go with the iron, nice decent bit. And we can undo the clamp and just check it. Of course, remember, solder is liquid, it can be reheated, it can be moved about again. Now remember, if it goes wrong, you can always go back, unsolder it, a little bit of flux, and just gently pull away the side from the end as it's molten, and clean it up with files, fiberglass brush, etc., and then have another go. Solder isn't like super glue, it's a bit like welding in a sense, and therefore you can go back and have another go if it goes wrong. And it's rare there's a mistake that is completely fatal, and you can go back and have another go. And although it's a bit of a faff to do that, and of course I've done that plenty of times, you'll find it's far easier to do it now at this stage than later on when you find that the coach isn't square when you go to paint it or something like that. So we now have a box. Okay, so I've just used the files to clean up the those fillets on in the inside of the 90-degree bends, and I also found I had to just remove something like 1/4 of a mil off the ends here, just with the long file, just to allow it all to fit together. A little bit of tolerances within the kit design, that kind of thing. And we now have a coach that's really starting to look, well, like a coach. It's a box. We've got the bogey pivots in, we've got the underframe. Now what we need to do is to set this ride height, if you like, so that kind of beam is going to be at the right height and meet the ends here. And we'll do that by popping those famous little brackets in here at the ends to meet that hole there, and then we can put a screw through and tie it all together. So thanks everyone, that concludes part 4 of this series. We've now got the body together with all 4 sides there clamped in. We've done the drop lights, and we're pretty much ready now to get the chassis attached to the body. We will do that in the next episode, which will be coming out on Thursdays, and we can then start thinking about the roof and how we're going to curve it, how we're going to solder it on, and ultimately this is really going to start looking like a coach. So I hope you are enjoying this. I hope you're having a go yourself. That's what this is all about, and we'll see you in a week. Do like and subscribe.